What Remains of Edith Finch is presented as a video game, but is more accurately characterized as an interactive story. This intentional choice by the developers deepens the poetic and intimate narrative, focusing on themes of loss, guilt, and generational trauma. The experience is concise yet resonant, allowing it to be played through in a single sitting. The player follows Edith Finch as she returns to her abandoned childhood home after her mother's death. She reveals early on that she hasn't been back since her older brother's funeral, which was about 7 years ago. Edith finds a key left by her mother and learns it opens several secret passages throughout the house. These passages grant entry to the many locked rooms within the house, all of which had belonged to her older family members who have since passed, and that she had only been able to see through a peephole in the door growing up. As Edith moves from room to room, she uncovers short stories about each family member, each told in a unique visual style. Throughout her life and in her family's lives, a curse has weighed on the Finch's shoulders. The Finch family curse has affected them for generations, with their misfortune growing into something fantastical and unexplainable over time. The truth of the curse is left to be speculated on, even upon finishing the game, though it's clear it has been fabricated and passed down in order to avert blame and guilt regarding the nature of the unfortunate deaths. As we continue to explore and uncover the truth behind the fantastical stories left by her grandmother, it becomes apparent that the Finches have an extremely difficult time accepting blame, manifesting as an unwillingness to change and acknowledge the past. The game presents loss not as a single event, but as an inherited experience, emphasizing how grief, trauma, and storytelling intertwine to shape identity and family history. The Finch family tree, from as far back as what's recorded, begins with Odin Finch in Norway. After losing his wife and child during the birthing process, Odin believes he can outrun the curse by traveling across the ocean, ultimately fulfilling the prophecy of the curse by attempting to bring his family home with him, collapsing on him during a storm. His daughter, Edith, referred to as Edie throughout the game, survived on a raft and attempted to rebuild on the coast where the wreckage occurred, refusing to run from the curse. Her and her husband, Sven, begin a family, their children being Molly and Barbara, and the twins, Calvin and Sam. Sam is left as the sole survivor of his generation and goes on to have a short-lived family with his first wife, Kay, having Dawn and Gus before Sam loses her to a divorce when they unexpectedly lose their last child, Gregory, when he was just a baby. Dawn, being the sole survivor of her siblings, goes on to have Louis, Milton, and Edith before losing her husband, Sanji. Now that we have been introduced to the somewhat complicated Finch family tree, what defines lyrical literature? Our lyric theory class proposes criteria to determine whether a medium is lyrical. A piece is considered lyrical if it is brief, musical, or rhythmic, filtered through a constructed lyric I that reflects solitary emotion and memory, and addresses an abstract or absent you. It expresses private feelings, can include a veiled political message, reflects community, addresses the limits of language, and seeks heightened understanding. Lyricism is difficult to define because of its roots in emotion, subjectivity, and fragmentation. It prioritizes sensory experience over linear plot or logic, which can lead to gaps due to the limits of human language. English, being less expansive than some other languages, makes it hard to express many feelings. Lyricism often centers on single moments, images, and feelings. It lets meaning emerge through tone, rhythm, and metaphor. Ambiguity and fragmentation are key to lyricism. Words and voices may be unstable and untrustworthy. Time is a fluid construct, sometimes repeating, sometimes collapsing. Even the spaces between words can carry as much meaning as language itself. Lyricism resists definition, remaining open-ended and inviting interpretation. Refusing to resolve uncertainty makes emotional truth more important than facts. The reader, or in this case, the player, takes on an active role, shaping understanding through ambiguity, memory, resonance, and feeling rather than explanation. What Remains of Edith Finch employs a lyrical form in an almost anthological way, with each story told through a different visual mode, each revealing more about who each family member was and how their deaths were perceived and reflected by the narrator. Lyricism utilizes the lyric I, which is the speaking consciousness of the poem or story, not always the narrator or author, but rather a constructed voice filtering emotion and feeling. The I in What Remains of Edith Finch centers around Edith herself, acting as a much more personal sense of remembrance and inquiry as she attempts to make sense of the curse and her inherited grief that has plagued her. Her act of journaling and tracking her family's history is in order to make sense of the loss she has experienced throughout the entirety of her life. Her voice is further emphasized by the moving, dissolving text that serves as the game's subtitles, both of which utilize the power of the lyrical speaker, shaping memory through tone, reflection, and emotion rather than certainty. This I is further complicated by the game, which changes as we are introduced to the stories, often told through Edie's fantastical imaginings of different circumstances, or by the family members whose deaths we are reliving. Each death is dramatized in some way to shift the narrative towards the curse being at fault rather than the truth. Since most of the deaths we encounter throughout the game are preventable, the result of neglect or just a small lapse in judgment. As we play and interact throughout the story, we, the player, become bearers of the lyric eye ourselves, inhabiting the lives of some characters in their final moments before their deaths, and directly affecting them by pressing buttons and moving our mouse. Although Edith's voice often frames the overall narrative, each individual story transfers subjectivity to the player, aligning our physical actions with the consciousness of different members of the Finch family. Even by performing small, mundane gestures, we can watch as our actions become synchronized with the voiceover and visual narrative, decreasing the distance between us and the experience and providing a more intimate interaction between player and character. This sometimes erratic transfer of the lyric I renders it completely fluid and transmissible, emphasizing how grief and memory are carried, briefly and imperfectly, from one person to the next. Grief is one of those emotions that cannot be explained logically, simply because the feeling is illogical. To describe the emptiness, the weight that loss can inflict on an individual or a family is nearly impossible unless you've experienced it yourself. What Remains of Edith Finch challenges the idea of forcing such intense and complicated emotions into a linear progression, instead offering a much more episodic, open-ended world in which the player can choose to uncover more secrets or play only what is necessary to progress throughout the story. Lyrical forms are particularly well-suited to express themes of emotional rupture and loss, mirroring the real, non-linear psychological experience of grief, which can manifest and grow in many different ways. The Finch family house, upon first view, appears to be growing almost like a tree or a weed, completely unstable and unsettling. Edith remarks that being back at the house brings her a strange sense of peace and nostalgia, but in an off-putting way, like a smile with too many teeth. The interior of the house matches the exterior, disorderly and messy, as we later learn due to the frantic state in which Dawn and Edith left the house the night before it became abandoned. Each locked bedroom is untouched and unspoiled by time, appearing like a memorial or shrine to the deceased. Each room and each story it contains functions more as a lyrical elegy than a celebration or remembrance of life. Each family member is memorialized at the time of their death, serving as their sole defining attribute in Edie's eyes, the mastermind behind the shrine-like rooms. Each ambiguously decorated and detailed room represents the fragmented memory left behind of each of the Finches. This fragmentation acts in large part to reflect how generational trauma is inherited in partial mythologicalized forms. Each of the family members who remain, one by one, has to be continuously subjected to and surrounded by death, with this forcing them to deal with their inevitable mortality at a young age and live in fear of it, or in spite of it, only for the curse to become the reason of their own end. The house becomes an inescapable tomb, filled with both the dead and the living, and their memories. Secret passages connect the rooms and are the only way in and out of the locked memorials, adding to the level of mystery and secrecy surrounding each death. Though it is not the first story we play through, Odin's death is what kickstarts the beginning of the curse and the development of the house we know today. His expedition, while grand and extraordinary, is a failed attempt to heal, or even to run away, because of his insistence on bringing his family's house along. This and his symbolic death highlight his true inability to let the tragedy he faced go, immortalizing it into a curse and attempting to outrun it with the weight of his unresolved past dragging behind him. His story is told through a newsreel, a short film popularized around the middle of the 20th century, which served primarily as an early form of visual news, but was sometimes used for other forms of entertainment. The choice to depict his expedition and death through this medium is to create a direct contrast between the story we've played so far and the events told in this, much more objective form of media. The newsreel format suggests credibility and distance, yet its exaggerated tone undermines this and directly highlights how public narratives overwrite grief and personal loss. Grief cannot be fairly told through any medium, much less one that claims objectivity, as emphasized by the presence of the newsreel. Odin's refusal to properly restart and his inability to leave the past behind him is what causes his demise, with this publicized story of his death only further fueling speculation of a curse surrounding the family and encouraging Edie's fantastical romanticization of these losses. This is truly highlighted in the death of Edie's husband, Sven, who appears to have been in some kind of an accident while building the house, but is shown in a news article as eaten by a dragon. In reality, it had been a slide designed as a dragon that was involved in the accident, emphasizing Edie's inability to handle the reality of her grief.
Whatever's wrong with this family, it goes back a long ways.
Molly's death is the first death we play through, and easily one of the most preventable. At the age of 10, she is sent to bed without supper, a cruel but popular punishment at this time, one I was subjected to many times as a kid. Going a step further, Edie locks her daughter in her room and all but ignores her pleas of hunger. In desperation, Molly searches around her room, eating anything of substance. A rotten, feces-touched carrot, toothpaste, and poison holly berries that are decoratively placed over her window. After eating, it can be assumed that Molly became delirious and ill, likely aspirating and passing away before Edie found her, but through Molly's journal, which we find in her bedroom once we uncover the secret passages, we learn her account of the night. We transform with her into different animals and mythical beasts, eating all we can find in every form, before eventually finding our way back to our bedroom and hiding from the monster we had just recently been, stating that we already know we don't have long, and that we know, and the creature knows, that we'll be delicious. It is left ambiguous as to whether this journal entry is truly written by Molly or instead written by Edie as a way to deal with the shame and horror of her daughter's death. A death that is directly the result of the negligence of a parent, something extremely difficult to rationalize and find the logic behind. Molly's death is one of the most fantastical of the bunch, despite being the most average and ordinary way for a child to die. In order for Edie to dispense guilt and blame towards herself, she creates a narrative driven by childhood wonder and curiosity, romanticizing and sensationalizing her death instead of confronting it. The game mechanics truly increase the overall experience in this particular story, as we are filled with Molly's childhood wonder, viewing the world from the simplicity of a child's perspective. Each animal is bigger and grander as the experience reaches a climax and we become an uncontrollable monster with unquenching thirst. This helps build an intimate and immersive experience, allowing this death to impact us as the player, with the silence and Edith's narration serving as the fragmentation between each story. Barbara's death is presented in comic book formatting and depicting an extremely dramatized reenactment of her last night. Barbara was a child movie star, ultimately ignored after her inability to scream at the same pitch as she had been able to as a child. I do believe this mirrors the real neglect all the Finch children faced by their parents, with Barbara experiencing it from the entire world. She's unable to move on from her past as a child star, unable to capture her perfect scream, leaving her and the people in her life obsessing over the past in an attempt to rekindle her fame. Barbara's death is by far the most violent and terrible, as she is shown to be afraid in her final moments, despite them being rather ambiguous. Her death is described as being due to monsters on Halloween night, though the story explains there had been home invasions in the neighborhood lately, as well as the police mentioning the blame had been put on her boyfriend, who hadn't been seen since that night. While there are many different ways to speculate, both reasons would be yet another example of Edie's negligence towards her children. Whether she left her daughter alone during a time of dangerous home invasions or with a dangerous boyfriend/obsessive fan, she made the decision to do so when it was unsafe. Once again, Edie's inability to learn from her past and directly confront her loss is reflected in the theatrical and dramatic nature of her retelling of her daughter's death.
Barbara's death impacts her family greatly, leaving her twin brothers with a thirst for life after being surrounded by so much death. Death becomes something that appears to them as inevitable, leaving the twins to neglect their own safety in a search for adventure in life. Calvin especially becomes a bit of a risk-taker and adventure seeker, with his room covered in space-related items. Sam narrates his twins' death through a poem, though the reality of his death is shown through the visual narration.
Sam's poem narrates rhythmically as we watch the swing set get more and more powerful until suddenly we fly off. This swing set creates a visual metaphor between risk and balance, death and life. Life must be enjoyed, but death must still be feared, all in a balance. This balance is quickly forced out of control by Kelvin's desire for more. The player's participation in this moment creates an impending sense of doom, as we are unable to do anything but push the swing further, forcing us further into the air until we ultimately lose all control. Sam's whimsical poem depicts Calvin's death, showing his adaptation of Edie's trauma response. Edie forces Sam to keep growing up in the same room he once shared with his twin, his part of the room blocked off like a shrine. Sam wakes up and goes to sleep every day, reminded that his twin is no longer with him. Sam, more than anyone, is reminded constantly of a part of himself that he will never be able to bring back. Walter was the only witness to Barbara's death, with the experience scarring him psychologically and inflicting him with terrible agoraphobia. Walter, still a child, hides away in the basement of the house, terrified by the random rumbles he perceives to be the monsters that killed his sister. Edie fuels her son's anxiety and fear, bringing him the supplies necessary for him to continue living as a shell of himself in their basement. Walter's life becomes completely ruled by ritual and routine, emphasizing emotional stasis and the inability to move on from loss. Walter's bunker becomes a lyrical place, echoing solitary reflection and his state of mind as closed and introspective, where silence and anticipation carry as much meaning as action. After decades of hiding away, Walter gathers the courage to escape through the wall underground, emerging into the sunlight in search of emotional release and meaning, only to be struck immediately by an oncoming train, the exact noise he had thought was the monsters that had killed his sister. The cruel irony and suddenness of his death contrasts with his long and isolating life, creating a lyrical rupture akin to a line break that abruptly ends a poem. Lyrically, Walter's story suggests that trauma shapes how one lives and how one anticipates death. His death is a direct result of his fear of confronting Edie, as he could have simply walked up the stairs, but instead risks his life in order to tunnel out from underground. Edie, being the one who fed into his delusions most, feared Walter's relationship with reality because it would force her to come to terms with the reality that her children's death were all the result of her inability to move on and confront loss. Sam, the sole survivor among his siblings, has grown up to build a family with his wife Kay, only for them to experience marital problems not long after the birth of their third child. Gregory's death is lyrically striking and instantly memorable due to Sam's narration of the event, which is told to us through a letter attached to his divorce papers. Rather than framing the event as a preventable accident or instance of negligence, Sam recounts Gregory's final moments as a surreal and dreamlike experience, saturated with innocence. Sam favors wonder over tragedy, much like his mother, allowing fantasy to momentarily overtake reality in order to escape the true pain of his loss. We become Gregory in his final moments, the sequence unfolding like a lullaby and creating the illusion of a hypnotic sense of calm. Sam preserves Gregory's innocence in this moment and refuses to place blame, allowing ambiguity to be his last act of love to his son and former wife. His inability to speak on the matter and confront the truth behind Gregory's death creates a hostile environment for Sam's other children.
I'm sure he's happy.
Thus, particularly as he struggles to come to terms with the idea of his father remarrying.
And he'd want you to be happy too.
Feelings of being ignored and neglected grow as his father
Good luck,
refuses to
Kay.
allow his children the time they need to
Love,
process
Sam.
grief. The game displays this emotional violence and turmoil as the active destruction of his father's wedding, as we, the player, continue to build the storm around us until it becomes completely uncontrollable. Dawn's heartbreaking narration of Gus's death immerses the player in the environment.
My father made him come of
Forces that are vast, uncontrollable, and indifferent. The storm acts as a poetic agent, shaping rhythm, movement, and perception, allowing beauty and violence to coexist and create a grand spectacle. Gus's death uses lyricism to emphasize emotional truth over narrative logic, suggesting that the experience of loss resists explanation and can be powerful and terrifying if left unchecked. In an attempt to help his only surviving child, Dawn, outrun the family curse, Sam teaches her to fight and to hunt, teaching her to fear life and question her own mortality consistently. Sam's sequence places us in the shoes of the observer, staring at the moments through the lens of a camera, moving the story forward.
Perfect.
Am I gonna have to shoot anything?
The moment in an attempt to preserve legacy and composure. That sense of stability quickly collapses when Sam falls off the face of a cliff after the deer twitches. His death directly mirrors his twin, with both losing balance, highlighting how fast safety can become vulnerability. Kelvin's childlike exhilaration and Sam's adult confidence are separated by age and circumstance, yet both are undone by the same illusion, that control can be maintained at the edge of danger. The abruptness of both falls acts as a lyrical line break, ending without warning and leaving meaning suspended rather than resolved. By mirroring Calvin's death in Sam, the game suggests that generational trauma doesn't merely repeat in theme, but in form, with the neglect for safety and well-being being passed down through each generation. This dissonance mirrors lyric poetry's reliance on juxtaposition and break, where meaning emerges through contrast rather than causality. Sam's death reveals the limits of control and the futility of attempting to choreograph safety in an unpredictable world. Dawn leaves as soon as she's able to, attempting to get as far away from her family as possible. Unfortunately, you can't run from something in your blood, and she's drawn back to the house after her husband's abrupt death in order to raise her 3 children. Her complete reluctance to mention the curse or discuss the death of the other members of the family acts as fuel to the fire rather than her goal of escaping it. Milton disappears after the family has moved back for some time, completely vanishing one day. This disappearance is not defined by spectacle or confirmed death like the rest of the family, but instead by its absence, ambiguity, and the idea of imaginary escape, all of which are hallmarks of lyrical expression. Milton's sequence takes place in the form of a small picture book, dissolving into uncertainty as he steps into his painting. This death, as well as his brothers, truly aligns with the ideals of escapism, with the children surrounded by death their entire lives, unable to talk about it, yearning for a way out, a way to live, freedom from the shackles of the curse. Milton's internal world is externalized as his paintings are sprawled throughout his room, drawings on the walls, suggesting that imagination becomes a vehicle for survival as much as disappearance. The ambiguity of his disappearance denies grief, leaving room for hope despite Dawn fully believing her son is gone. Milton's disappearance, grounded in imaginative escape, prepares the player for the dark reality of Lewis's death. Dawn's oldest son, whose sequence is narrated to us through a doctor's note regarding his mental health, struggles with reality and coming to terms with the death of his family members and brother's disappearance. After quitting smoking and sobering up, he lacks the numbness that marijuana was giving him, leading him to seek other methods of escapism in order to deal with his mundane and tedious reality. Lewis appears to live in a state between life and death, unable to live due to the trauma holding him down, yet unable to die until his imagination ultimately overtakes his reality completely and he commits suicide. This death sequence utilizes the lyrical immersion of the game in the best way possible as we play as Lewis, working at the cannery, grabbing fish, cutting their heads off, and doing it over again with the flick of our mouse. Slowly, Lewis's daydreams begin to overtake the screen, forcing you to focus on both things at once until you are completely immersed in his made-up world. This split-screen structure mirrors lyricism's emphasis on meaning arising from consciousness rather than external action. As his daydreams grow more elaborate, they take on more qualities of a lyrical nature, becoming more mythical, symbolic, and self-contained. Lewis's death, instead of being framed abruptly like the one before, is much more gradual, suggesting the imagination's ability to reorder perception, dissolving the boundary between story and self. His sense of identity fully resides within his daydreams, helping him sustain his reality until it ultimately consumes him. Much like Milton's death, due to the self-inflicted nature of Lewis's death, it doesn't allow for much resolution. A big part of his inability to accept his own reality was due to the traumas he to discuss and confront in reality. The night of Lewis's funeral is the night Dawn and Edith left the house 7 years ago, with Dawn arguing against Edie's stubbornness to leave her memorials behind and let go of the past, and Edie arguing for the importance of the preservation of family history through stories. Dawn and Edie both embody opposite coping styles in response to the accumulation of trauma throughout their lives, yet both inadvertently sustain the very cycle they seek to manage. Edie romanticizes and mythicizes the death of her family members, transforming each experience into a story worthy of preservation and wonder, finding meaning through narrative excess, softening the pain of tragedy through lyric beauty and repetition. Dawn copes through refusal to accept the truth and attempting to gain whatever control she can manage, rejecting her grandmother's obsession with death in an attempt to save herself and her family by severing them from the house and from the stories. By suppressing her feelings rather than confronting them, Dawn leaves the trauma unresolved and unprocessed, allowing it to persist in silence and building a mysterious allure around the idea of the curse. Dawn would attempt to hide the truth from Edith and her siblings, while Edie twists and manipulates the narrative to feed her own delusions surrounding blame and guilt. Both feed into the mystical nature of the curse, fueling Edith's desire for truth. Both women are the only two without any type of memorial in the house, with Dawn's passing away from illness after Edie passed away the night they'd left her. Dawn and Edie's lives and subsequent deaths are only preserved through Edith's memory. Their coping strategies differed in form but converged in effect, both shaping the emotional environment Edith inherits, with her memory being the only thing that allows them to live on. Edith is left with only pieces of the truth, forcing her to dig for answers and resolution, only understanding the truth behind the family's curse as she matures, now becoming a mother herself. Edith admits to being more understanding of Edie's method of coping, being completely enamored and mystified by her grandmother's stories. Though now that she is more able to distinguish between truth and exaggeration, she is able to come to terms with her own grief surrounding the loss of her entire family. Edith is the sole survivor, passing on the mantle to her son when dying during childbirth. The truth behind her visit and the motivation behind her journaling is her insistence on keeping the memory and history alive, with us learning as the game ends that her narration hasn't been directed at us, but instead at her son, reading her journal for the first time and revisiting the house after her passing. Her decision to remember and pass on the history to her son is an acknowledgement of their past loss and trauma, ensuring that the Finch's family experiences are understood and felt while allowing memory and mourning to exist alongside life, creating a space for grief to be held rather than passed down. Each death accumulates like verses in an elegy, demonstrating how video games can achieve profound lyrical significance by using fragmented narration and sensory immersion to convey the emotional weight of memory, grief, or generational trauma. Each story functions as a poem of its own, using repetition, rhythm, metaphor, and ambiguity to shape how loss is experienced rather than explained. The game renders death as intimate and universal through each story, emphasizing the idea of feeling over causality. Through the opposing coping mechanisms of Dawn and Edie, and Edith's act of preserving her history, and how each sequence is played out visually, What Remains of Edith Finch employs lyricism to create a meditation on mortality, inheritance, and the preservation of memory, showing that grief and love can coexist, though held together delicately through a blend of both confrontation and letting go.